I came in last night too, just because I didn't want to run the risk.
Yeah.
But even last night, I guess it was weather late in the midday or
Did you come into regular?
regular.
Okay.
The storm that came through here yesterday afternoon was savage.
tough.
Yeah, it was really
I got that feeling.
sideways wind. And
Yeah, by the time I got here, it wasn't like that, but I could see everybody's back there.
Let's travel into the summer.
Yeah.
In the southeast. Right? Yeah.
Late last night. It was when they rebooked me, it was supposed to be earlier, but I sat around the lamp for a long time.
Here's the senator. I don't know if we should get out of the way of the podium. Where did you grow up? Great university. Yeah.
Get your name on there.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Jason Gourmet with the Bipartisan Policy Center. A delight to be in this august room to talk about a topic that I think certainly unites all of us, and that is our shared imagination about the importance of innovation in this society. Despite the tribal realities that dominate so many committee rooms at the moment, I think this is an issue that everyone who really understands and cares about the future of our economy and our security has some investment in. The anchor for this discussion for us has been, for the last several years, the American Energy Innovation Council, which came together in 2010, a diverse group of business leaders and job creators from many different sectors who all had the same shared belief that innovation is, in fact, the engine of our economy and what fundamentally differentiates the American experience from all of our competitors. We also believe much in the partnership between the public and private sector, and think a lot about what we think the critical role of limited government is in this innovation process. Now, I think you would probably not be here if the ideas I just mentioned did not feel somewhat obvious to you, but we recognize that there are a lot of other rooms in this building and a lot of other budget pressures that the Congress and the administration are grappling with. So we are not naive in thinking that there is not, in fact, a real battle on our hands. We have tried to lay out in a report released today by the principals of AEIC, a set of recommendations, and I'll just mention a few of them. We fundamentally believe that our federal government should be tripling its investment in energy innovation, doing that upstream and taking on the responsibility that no private sector entity, even the courageous efforts of the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, can see fit to fund. We believe the crown jewel of this program is ARPA-E, and believe it should be funded at $1 billion a year, and certainly no less than the $300 million a year that has been sustaining it up until now. We believe that ARPA-E is not just an engine of grant making, but also an example for the entire DOE, and think that we should look to some of the principles of how it is managed and operated for reform of the broader agency. And we also believe that we need to support and expand recent efforts and arrangements like the Energy Innovation Hubs, the Energy Frontier Research Centers, Manufacturing USA program, things that really bring the kind of dynamic regional and local energies into the discussion. But ultimately, this is going to be about leadership. And when one thinks about the words energy, innovation, and leadership, you can't help but then immediately think Senator Lamar Alexander, because Senator Alexander has just been the anchor of this exercise really since its inspiration. It was Senator Alexander along with Senator Bingaman who initially called for the NAS study that became the rising above the gathering storm, which I really think is kind of the Rosetta Stone of what has inspired so much effort since then. He helped lead the adoption of the America Competes Act in 2007 and its reauthorization in 2010. He has not waned in his focus and enthusiasm. We recognize that persistence is one of the core values of democratic skill. Just recently, along with Senators Murkowski, Collins, Graham, Gardner, and Rounds, he sent a letter that we think was very influential on May 18th to the President, urging him to maintain DOE funding. He has specific interest in advanced nuclear, in vehicle innovation, and also is really a staunch supporter of just the basic science. He led the successful passage with Senator Durbin of an amendment in the Energy Modernization Act, which would have advanced $2.7 billion of funding for the Office of Science. Senator, we hope that you stick with that because we think it's really vital to the core of this effort. And so it really is an honor to be with you and to hear from you about what your thoughts are and what we all can do to support yours and other efforts to keep America's innovation vibrant. So, Senator, thank you.
Thank you. As Jason was talking, I was thinking of former Senator John Warner and the danger of introducing a United States Senator and giving them a podium that they can use for a while. Senator Warner said when he was a young man, he had just been elected to the Senator and wondering what to do. He was sitting there on the Senate floor, and one of the older senators came up, put his arm around him and said, "Young man," he says, "there's nothing to this business of being a senator." He said, "All you have to do is stand up, start talking, and eventually you'll think of something to say." So that's, I'm afraid, what we do too often. Today, I'd like to take about 10 minutes to congratulate the Bipartisan Policy Center and help inaugurate your Power of Innovation report on energy. And let me begin with a story. I can still remember the afternoon in 2005 when I was on the Budget Committee and we sat through a long day doing what Budget Committees still do, listening to the entire panoply and seeing the entitlement programs going up like this, and as they went up, they squeezed out the other parts of the budget, national defense, but research and development as well. And I realized then that unless we put a real spotlight on the importance of research in our competitive future, that we would get squeezed out of the federal budget. So I walked down to the National Academy of Sciences and I said to them a very simple thing, which sounds almost naive. I said, I think if you assemble a distinguished group of people who know what they're talking about and ask them to give to Congress 10 items in priority order that we should do to improve America's competitiveness, the Congress is likely to do it. Well, they did just that. They invited Norm Augustine, former head of Lockheed Martin, and a group of distinguished Americans that included people like Stephen Chu, later President Obama's energy secretary, and a Nobel Prize winner, who interrupted their summer vacations, came together, and they gave us 20 things instead of 10. And they included a whole series of recommendations, but they're in priority order. They were a consensus. They were introduced by the majority and minority leader of the Senate. When the Senate changed hands the next time, they were introduced by the same two in their same different roles. In 2007, we enacted the America Competes Act based upon their report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm. I tell you that to show how important it is to do what you're doing today, which is to have specific suggestions about what Congress can do, because you never know when it might be funded or when it might be done, but it might be done. The power of an idea around here is really pretty strong. A lot of the funding of the America Competes Act came in the first month or two of President Obama's term, even though President Bush had been the president that developed the report. During that discussion, there was a lot of debate about whether to make the report on America's competitiveness only about energy, because it was the opinion of many on that group that energy was the cornerstone of American competitiveness, and innovation in energy would do it. Well, they made it broader, but that persisted, and I think that's relevant to what you've done. I want to thank Jason, you and the Bipartisan Policy Council for your contribution to the work here on Capitol Hill. Most recently, you weighed in on what we call 21st Century Cures, which was an effort to move new treatments and medical devices and cures through the investment and regulatory process and into medicine cabinets and into doctors' offices more rapidly. That sounds easy to do, really very difficult to do. Took about a year and a half. It was a strong bipartisan effort, and the outside effort that the Bipartisan Policy Council added to what we did was important. About a year ago, I was standing at a Bipartisan Policy Council event with Doug Oliver from Nashville, who Bill Frist had introduced me to. Doug had been blind for a number of years, and he'd found a regenerative medicine treatment that had literally restored his sight. And as a result of that, regenerative medicine became a part of our bill. Doug and Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, have become good friends, and they're working together to make sure we make those advances, but do it in the right way. So advocacy of this kind can make a real difference on Capitol Hill. Senator McConnell called the 21st Century Cures bill that the BPC had a role in the most important legislation last year. It affects virtually every American family. The Congress has added to the funding that it put into biomedical research, $2 billion last year, $2 billion more dollars this year. The way we count dollars around here, that's likely to be $20 billion over 10 years, plus $20 billion over 10 years, plus $4.5 billion from the Cures bill. So that's probably $44–45 billion over the next 10 years in increased support for biomedical research. But medical research isn't the whole story. Just as I mentioned, energy research deserves the same attention, and there's plenty of bipartisan potential for that support. When we think about energy research, many people think of clean air or climate change only, but it's much more fundamental than that, which is why the Rising Above the Gathering Storm group 10 and 12 years ago considered making it the cornerstone of their research. Really, the whole goal of Rising Above the Gathering Storm was to help America keep its brainpower advantage. Several of the specific recommendations had to do with energy. ARPA-E was one. Everyone saw the great success of DARPA in the Defense Department, GPS, the internet, other major inventions, a different way of doing things, bringing businesses into the government and helping them and then pushing them back out in their early stages and see if they can make it there. That's what we decided to do with energy, and it's worked pretty well. I think that the $300 million we spend on ARPA-E every year is money very well spent. It's been 7 years since we've taken comprehensive action on energy innovation in the Congress, and we need to keep our eye on the ball. We take for granted the fact that the United States has only 4% of the people in the world, but we produce more than 20% of all the wealth in the world. And where does that come from? Well, most likely it comes disproportionately from innovation and from technological advantage. And we find that we may fall behind China's total R&D spending by the mid-2020s. We're not the only people in the world with good brains, and we're not the only people in the world who knows that a brain power advantage is a big advantage to rising family incomes. In fact, 11 other countries exceed us in energy research spending as a percentage of gross domestic product. The National Academy of Sciences has estimated that maybe 85% of our measured growth in U.S. income since World War II has come from technological change. And as most researchers tell me, it's hard to think of a major technological advantage since World War II that was not involved some form of government-sponsored research. Take, for example, natural gas. The development of unconventional gas, which has transformed the energy picture and transformed our economy, and in some ways transformed our foreign policy because of our lack of super dependence on foreign oil, was enabled in part by 3D mapping invented at Sandia National Laboratories in New Mexico, and by the Department of Energy's large-scale transportation or demonstration project. Then the American Free Enterprise System, our tradition of private ownership of mineral rights, took over and enabled Americans to capitalize on that more than any other country should. Second, the Southern Company, in 2016, through a public-private partnership with the Department of Energy, Oak Ridge Laboratory, and others, began exploring, developing, and demonstrating an advanced concept for nuclear generation known as Molten Chloride Fast Reactor. These new reactors will be safer, produce less waste, operate with higher efficiencies, and at a lower cost than the existing reactor fleet. That's important because nuclear power today produces 20% of our country's electricity, but more importantly, in some ways, 60% of our carbon-free electricity. And it must be part of any realistic energy plan for our future. But our next generation of nuclear reactors will likely not be possible without some government-funded research and support. And then a third example, a few weeks ago, our new Energy Secretary, Rick Perry, and I went to the Oak Ridge Laboratory. He was fascinated with the technological advancements there at that laboratory, as he has been at his visits to other laboratories. He's testifying before us on Thursday in the Appropriations Committee, and I'm going to say to him that I think he's gotten off to a faster start than most new secretaries of any kind, because he's been on the job here, but he's taken time to learn at what I call our nation's secret weapons, our national laboratories. At Oak Ridge, we saw advanced energy and materials research. We saw some of the fastest computers in the world. The United States now has 5 of the 10 fastest in the world, and the best and most innovative research on advanced manufacturing. We saw a collection of 3D printers from companies all over the United States that come to Oak Ridge for those techniques. The Secretary of Energy drove a car and a truck printed by 3D. Those companies that come to Oak Ridge and learn about the government-sponsored research there then return home to their own manufacturing companies where they make products quicker and better. Products like medical devices. In Memphis, I visited a medical device company that makes a tool used in replacing knees. They say that about a third of the knee replacements involve this 3D printed tool, which makes it almost impossible for the doctor to make an error in the cut, because every cut the doctor makes is personally tailored to the individual patient. And they expect that soon all of their knee replacements will use 3D printed tools. Robotic arms for airplane parts, whole cars like the one Secretary Perry drove. This technology is used by automotive and aviation. I keep thinking that government-sponsored research in 3D printing is beginning to transform the manufacturing sector in somewhat the same way that unconventional natural gas transformed the energy sector and will continue to shape Americans' energy policy for decades. Tennesseans know, and all over the country, I think people know, that this kind of research means thousands of high-tech jobs and higher family incomes for Americans. We've not, in our committee over the last several years, I mentioned the fact that we had focused, we had some record-setting levels of appropriations for biomedical research. We've done the same with energy research. RPE's at $306 million. There are 56 RPE project teams that have been formed. 74 more have attracted more than $1.8 billion in funding. In addition to that, we've had the highest level of funding in any appropriations bill for the Office of Science for the last 2 years. If we want to make sure America stays great, we want to make sure that we use the secret weapons of our research universities and our national laboratories. No other country in the world has research universities and natural laboratories like the United States does. So I've always supported doubling energy research. You go me one better on that, but there's nothing wrong with that. But there's no reason we can't afford to do it. And I think it's up to us and you to suggest ways to pay for it in a tight budget. I have suggested that one responsible way is to stop spending money on subsidies for mature energy technologies and spend that money instead for research. That would about pay for doubling the amount of energy research every year. We can't lose the technical advantages we've had. Government is about setting priorities, and the federal debt is not the result of energy research. It's the result of that part of the federal budget with entitlement spending that keeps going up like that, while everything else is going like that. So we need your advocacy. We welcome your report. I thank those of you who are here to participate in the panel and others to participate in the discussion. And Jason, I salute the Bipartisan Policy Council once again for its leadership and look forward to the results of your discussion. Thank you.
Can I get an amen? At the BPC, we have a quaint affinity for evidence, and really want to take an opportunity now to bring up a panel and have a real conversation that drills down a little bit on, I think, a lot of the big themes that the Senator was laying out. Our panel is a terrific group, going to be moderated by Ben Gieman, who, if you've been in this business for a while, you've spoken to Ben in many different, I think probably we went back to Boston in the 1980s, but Ben is a real font of knowledge. I want to invite Ben up to introduce our panelists and move the process forward.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me. I think that is on. So, good afternoon, everybody. I think Senator Alexander set the stage for a really engaging discussion on some things that are obviously quite topical and front of mind in the as the federal budget process goes forward. So let's bring up our panel. We have Mike Rosen, who's the VP for Corporate Communications and Affairs with American Air Liquide. We've got Steve Wilson, the General Manager for R&D at Southern Company, and we have Rich Powell, the Executive Director of the ClearPath Foundation. So if you guys all want to come on up, we will get started. So as I mentioned, I think Senator Alexander set the stage pretty well for a good discussion. I think we're going to sort of the plan is to forego sort of opening statements and really kind of jump right in and sort of try and pick up where the senator left off. So Steve, I wanted to start with you. And sort of try and get some of Southern Company's, your company's perspective on innovation strategy, because one of the things I think is interesting about Southern is that obviously you guys are, I think, the second largest power company in the country, a huge established company, but you also have an internal innovation R&D arm, if I'm not mistaken, and I'd love to get some thoughts on what Southern views as kind of the nexus or the benefits of collaboration between private industry and Energy Department research.
Okay, it's good to be here. So Southern's had an R&D organization, as you referred to, for some 50 years. Most all of the work that Southern does is a public-private partnership. We are very grateful for the relationship with DOE. We've had many R&D projects that are DOE sponsored. Senator Alexander mentioned the Molten chloride fast reactor project that we have, that will basically revolutionize how nuclear power is produced in the future. It's still several years out. It requires lots of R&D. That R&D needs a public-private partnership to see it through. Anything in the scale of energy supply and delivery is at such a large scale, it's very difficult for any one entity to do it on its own. We have, in fact, 10 other R&D centers that Southern Company operates. And as best I can recall, all 10 of those centers have some sort of public-private partnership involved. It's either DOE, it might be EPRI, it's partnerships with universities or with other utilities. So it's just extremely important for us to succeed in R&D for the future if we have a public-private partnership.
And what would you say have been some of the biggest fruits of that collaboration? You know, you mentioned some of the nuclear innovation. What are some of the greatest hits of your company's history with the Energy Department?
Well, Emissions control, several years ago, several decades ago actually, the evolution of emissions control for power plants was really fostered through a public-private partnership. It took decades really to sort of mature up a fleet of emission control technologies. So very active with DOE in those programs. As we deployed smart grid technologies, our partnership with DOE is there. I mentioned just briefly the nuclear project, but we also have a brand new project on a community of the future, where the way we'll live with distributed resources and solar and generation and a microgrid that sort of helps a community. We have a brand new project with a public-private partnership associated with DOE. Oak Ridge National Lab, in fact, is helping us develop the very software that will integrate the homes with the solar and the battery and the backup generation.
Thank you. Certainly, that's a pretty big diversity of technologies, and let's move on to even more, actually. Mike, I wonder if you can sort of talk for a little while about what has been the impact on your company of Energy Department and just federally sponsored and federally backed innovation research in general.
Well, certainly it's been an important driver for us all. At Air Liquide, and it's probably good to give some perspective, we're an industrial gas company, not natural gas, industrial gases, oxygen, nitrogen, process gases like hydrogen. And in our business, we touch every sector of manufacturing, every sector of industry, and healthcare, and everything in between. We have a unique perspective in that we touch all of those industries, we touch all of those sectors. So it enables us to really see deep into what those needs and drivers are. I think for us, some recent examples include actually a more distant example, if I can counter that, by saying that as we look at hydrogen, which is something that we're looking at a driver of the future, both as a form of energy, a storage medium, vehicular transportation. Hydrogen fuel cell technology was driven out of the space program back in the 60s. It's developed further, of course, over the decades, and now is at a point where we can literally drive hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. We can power cities. We can provide grid demand management alongside of it. Membrane technology from within our organization. We've developed membranes that can separate particles of air, molecules, and develop everything from biofuels to breathing apparatus and everything in between. These were formed out of relationships with the national labs over the years. So all of these things, all of these joint relationships, all of these joint programs have really pushed and gave us opportunity that didn't exist before. And it's not limited to the DOE and to the labs. It's also the ability to bring partnerships along with academic institutions and share knowledge and really be able to collaborate and implement and deploy technology as it's developed.
Thank you. And one thing I neglected to mention right at the top was I've certainly got my share of questions for our panelists, but I think all of you have some index cards on your chairs, so please think of some questions, and as you guys come up with your own questions, please write them down on those cards, and there's going to be somebody collecting them, so we'll get those in front of our panelists in a little while as well. Thank you. Rich, I wanted to move on to you, and ClearPath is something of a not right out of it, not brand new, but a somewhat new kind of presence in debates over energy policy and innovation policy. So could you tell us briefly a little bit about ClearPath, but also can you give us ClearPath's view of the direction that federal research and development needs to take?
Sure. Well, first, thanks very much to BPC and AEIC for having us here at this terrific event. ClearPath is a relatively new organization. I think we've been here active in DC for about a year and a half. We're founded by Jay Faison, a conservative Republican entrepreneur who decided he wanted to do something interesting in the energy space, obviously an entirely too polarized space. I think the reason that we've decided to focus deeply on the innovation topic is that this really is a topic, maybe uniquely, that brings us together as opposed to pulling us apart in our political dialogue. We think we continue to see bipartisan support for expanding and deepening, and in some cases reforming our energy innovation budgets. We also, as a conservative organization, want to make sure that dollars are very well spent when they're going into, eventually cleaning up our energy supply. And if you look across the different policy levers that we've pulled as a country to try and increase our share of clean energy, innovation really has the best track record. So if you look at the senator's remarks and the remarkable history of the shale gas revolution, Frankly, that was a couple of $100 million spent very well at DOE in the 70s and 80s with some small targeted tax incentives to get non-traditional oil and gas off the ground that has resulted in a dramatic decarbonization of our power sector and in a way that is beyond affordable. It's actually in some ways disruptively crashed energy prices, which causes some other issues and problems. But so in terms of where we would like to see this go, if you look at the shale revolution, if you look at things like the Sunshot Initiative or the Joint Bioenergy Initiative out at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, we've seen incredible success when DOE, both at the applied offices and in the laboratories, has made a deep commitment to a technology, set a very aggressive economic-based goal, staffed its best people on that project, and funded it continuously and given it support over the better part of a decade. We've made incredible breakthroughs when we've made those kinds of commitments. We think there are a number of areas that could benefit well, and actually BPC's report highlights a number of those. We think setting really aggressive grand challenge goals in Gen 3 carbon capture and grid scale storage and advanced nuclear could perhaps recreate the kind of moment that we had with the shale gas revolution. So we're spending a lot of our time and our focus there.
When you talk about setting those kind of aggressive sort of grand goals, is that something that has been lacking? I think, I don't think there's a lot of disagreement, or my guess is there's probably not a lot of disagreement in the room about the sort of threshold value of federally backed innovation. But when you get down to the particulars, it seems like there's some different views. So that's kind of a long way of asking, do you think that the Energy Department has succeeded in being as kind of ambitious as you would like?
I think in some spaces. So, again, over the last, basically in the course of the last administration, we had the Sunshot Initiative and we had the Joint Bioenergy Initiative, JBay, and both of those have been tremendously successful. I think we haven't applied this approach nearly as much on the baseload side, so on clean fossil fuels and on advanced nuclear, so we think that that could benefit. And, if you're a big supporter of nuclear, if you're a big supporter of renewables, if you're just a big supporter of a better, more flexible grid, everyone knows that we need better grid scale storage, and we don't have that really deep commitment on grid scale storage, and we could benefit from that.
Steve, did you want to kind of weigh in there? Would you find yourself in agreement with Rich that we sort of need to perhaps, that the Energy Department needs to kind of perhaps raise the bar a little bit or look a little bit broader when in terms of kind of innovation on big baseload as well as storage?
Definitely. I'll use an example that's active right now. Many years ago, we did a very early, small-scale demonstration of an amine scrubbing process, basically for flue gas to remove CO2. It was a very small pilot. It was on the back of a truck. We found problems. We fixed those, and then moved it to a 25-megawatt scale with public-private money, with a DOE, EPRI, several other utilities participated at that scale to get it closer to the kind of scale that we needed at a full-scale power plant, but still found additional things that needed to be resolved. We did that, and then that same technology was the subject of the Petronova demonstration that got lots of press, I believe, last year as it started up. Very successfully. I think that whole theme there says that, yes, there are many opportunities like that in large supply of electricity.
Thank you.
If I could add on, I think in addition to what we're talking about here, we need to take a look at our perspective as companies, public-private partnerships, and leadership. We can fund everything we want to fund. We can innovate everything we want to innovate. But unless we've got leaders who are going to help make this come to fruition, help see the vision and help make things happen, none of this is going to take place. So here today, it's a great step. The report talks about some very significant recommendations to move innovation, especially in the energy world, along further. But the leadership that's going to be required to make that happen is ever so important, and we shouldn't be forgetting that either.
Well, that actually feeds nicely into what I wanted to ask about next, something of the elephant in the room, which is, well, put it this way. We had Senator Alexander say during his opening remarks, if I took this down correctly, he said, quote, the power of an idea around here is really pretty strong. And he was obviously speaking about the kind of wisdom of the importance of energy innovation and the economic effect of it and the effects on American competitiveness. That said, we're basically just a few weeks removed from a Trump administration budget proposal that would enact what I think would be fair to say historic cuts in R&D budgets, including outright elimination of the RPE program. So I guess one question I sort of have for all of you, maybe it's a bit abstract, is how did we get to this point, and do you feel that the Trump administration is flexible on this, or is it going to be kind of a constant battle?
I think we may be more aligned than we think we are. I think we would share the view that the administration, the Congress, is looking to innovate. I think a lot of the policies that have come to the forefront, whether it's infrastructure, tax reform, are leading us in the direction to really drive innovation. And I think the time is right. So I guess I choose to look at the positive as opposed to the roadblocks, but I think there's certainly alignment there.
Rich, I wanted to get you to jump in on kind of a similar point. I mean, you know, most reporters in town have written stories to the effect of, you know, both Democrats, but, you know, equally, or probably more importantly right now, Republicans are, you know, essentially rejecting President Trump's push for these deep cuts in R&D and innovation spending. That said, I kind of wonder if there is a fairly strong impact to those proposed cuts, even if they are not enacted, in the sense of we've got this new report today from the AEIC looking for essentially a tripling of the R&D and innovation budget. Does the Trump administration proposal, even if it doesn't have political legs in terms of the cuts that he's seeking, does it serve to sort of constrain the parameters of what's possible in budget debates?
So I think it does have an unfortunate signaling to the long-term trajectory, right? These things, if we're going to triple, it's not like we're going to triple all at once in 2020. The appropriations process works by gradually building up a relatively smooth curve, right? So we need to be putting large increases into the system every year if we're going to get to these big numbers. And we're not necessarily supportive of a tripling or a doubling. We think we ought to be building from sort of the grand challenges up. So how much do we need in order to demonstrate a bunch of advanced nuclear technologies or a bunch of advanced carbon capture technologies? But that is going to take more resources than we currently have. We are the first to say that there are large efficiencies to be found in DOE, and that the general impetus to find ways to spend the money more effectively in DOE, and perhaps even, you know, significantly cut and reallocate some of those areas is an important and worthy goal. But we have some work to do to convince, I think, particularly OMB, that this is a worthwhile place to invest in deeply when, as you know, as Jason mentioned, we're sort of fighting tooth and nail for space in a maybe contracting budget.
Steve, I wonder if we could get you to jump in there. You know, I was listening to an interview with Tom Fanning, and he said, look, yours is an industry that doesn't plan on four-year horizon. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but the upshot of what he said was, your industry is not one that plans on four-year horizons, that plans on 20 and 40 and 60-year horizons. That said, I'm wondering, what is the relationship between sort of nearer-term R&D budgets and R&D and federally backed innovation and what that industry will look like in 20 and 40 and 60 years?
There's a path, a flow that technology development takes. The first stage is fundamental intellectual property creation. It's lots of failures there. There are many opportunities to find breakthroughs that occur that then you latch onto, and the next phase is you go to a scaled demonstration where you can manipulate the technology, but you do it at a size where if you make a mistake or if you find something new, you can fix it there without it costing a lot of money. I mean, you do it at a scale that's right. Then the last phase is that large scale demonstration. That first where you really learn how it integrates into the process. Will it function? Can you control it? All of those sorts of things. If you don't have all three of those, then you sort of stagnate somewhere. If I'm not priming the pump or not feeding that curve all the way, whether it be 1 year or 40 years, I've got somewhere along that continuum a technology being developed. So I answer that in a funny way, but I think you have to have all three of those, even at our 40-year horizon that we have, or 80-year. You've got to start somewhere small and then build to that whatever that technology is at 80 years. I mean, in the end, we're about supplying clean, safe, reliable, and affordable energy to our customers. I mean, technology aside, that's the primary function. I think we're going to get there through new technology. And an executive of Southern Company many years ago told me that it's technology that'll solve our challenges of the future. And that was his guiding sort of principle. So,
Thank you. Did you want to weigh in on that same question? I mean, your industry is one that has, obviously a certain nexus between, energy department programs on hydrogen and other technologies. I mean, what's the kind of nexus between these nearer term decisions and what some of the your company's positioning for 10, 20, 30 years in the future is going to be?
Sure. We look at, you talk about a 40-year horizon. We typically look at a 15 to 30-year horizon in our businesses and our investments. And, investments are really what drives this innovation, this growth, and ultimately prosperity. We have to have an environment in the United States where it makes sense to invest. We've invested as a company over $17 billion in the U.S. in capital expenditures and assets over the last 5 years. We hope to continue to do that, but as an organization, as a company that operates in over 80 countries around the world, we have to make those best decisions on where to deploy those assets, where to deploy that capital. And it's so important for the administration, for the legislature, for the labs, everybody involved to understand that this type of investment now is what's going to drive corporate investment in the future and down the road, job growth, manufacturing growth, domestic growth as a whole. So these are all inextricably linked. We talked about hydrogen a little bit and the nexus. I mean, you take a look at the fossil fuel world that we live in that's become so grand with horizontal drilling and the shale renaissance. Natural gas is the foundation of hydrogen. Hydrogen is produced by in most cases, from reforming natural gas. That's created an opportunity for us to take our fossil fuel portfolio, move it to the next level, and do so many different things with it, whether it's vehicular transportation, whether it's, we talked about electricity and power grid management. Hydrogen has the ability to use as a storage tool with energy, to deploy energy on demand. So you're taking old technologies, large resources that we have now, older technologies, I shouldn't say old, and using them as a nexus to a new age, a new advanced technology that will set us going forward.
Thank you. I wanted to ask us slightly out of the, well, actually, first a reminder, for everybody has some index cards on their chairs, so as you think of questions, please write them down, and we'll get them, we'll get as many as we can asked up here. But, before earlier Senator Alexander was talking about how, look, the United States, obviously is incredibly well positioned in the sense that, our national laboratories, our research universities remain crown jewels. We have incredible national laboratories. But I was also thinking that, at the same time, if you think of sort of the popular perception of how innovation occurs, right? I think it's often, the idea that it's, somebody in their mom's basement or their garage, right? It's the kind of renegade innovator. And I sort of wonder whether there's a sense, there's a popular perception out there that we don't need a strong federal role. Or perhaps maybe another way to put it is there's not the understanding of the kind of strong federal nexus and role. Rich, I wonder if you could kind of jump in on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you look at the difference between, how something like Airbnb was built, in an app over a weekend, right? And it's now the largest hotel in the world, right? And how something like the reactors at Vogtle are being built, which literally requires the largest crane in the world to move them around, right? The aircraft hangar-sized materials. It just couldn't be further apart, right? Energy innovation is hard, and it is huge and expensive, and it takes a long time, and it requires a lot of steel and welders to weld that steel that barely exist in this country anymore. I don't want to say we've gotten soft, but I think we have gotten lucky with a number of these high-tech innovations that are now driving large parts of our economy. And, we have let some of this heavy industry capability in our country atrophy over the past 20 years. And so when we then try and do really interesting new big things in energy, the first time is always hard because we're exercising muscles again that we haven't exercised in a long time. And the supply chains and the expertise and the, in many cases, the high-skilled labor that's behind those and required for those is no longer quite our expertise. And what we're worried about is that all of those things are the expertise of some of our most formidable trade competitors, right? In particular, China. They are really good at building big, expensive, heavy steel and concrete things. And they are well poised to eat our lunch around the world in all of the markets that are going to want to build these kinds of machines. And so unless there's a deep recommitment to this kind of heavy industrial innovation, sort of starting with the DOE and working its way through public-private partnerships, we're worried about China, taking over and taking the lead in things like advanced nuclear reactors all over the world. They're about to pilot a high-temperature gas reactor this year, probably a decade before we realistically could in this country. They're going to be so far ahead of us that we may not be able to catch up in that little sliver. And so we're very grateful to the Southern companies and the TerraPowers of the world that are trying to start the process of innovating competitive technologies in that space as well.
How do you get that?
But he mentioned the molten salt reactor. That actually started with a DOE program. The fundamental underpinnings of that intellectual property came from the 1960s with Oak Ridge National Labs in Tennessee, where they did work on that technology. So, I mean, it's at the end where you deploy technology needs the partnership as well as right up front.
And we were speaking about the kind of, earlier we were speaking about the kind of federal nexus between the innovations that led to the fracking boom as well. But, of course, again, to bring it back to the popular image, it's often of the kind of, renegade, wildcatter that perhaps thought of or pioneered all these things. So I guess a question for you two as well, and Rich, thanks for your answers on this. How do you change the public perception of what it takes to have the U.S. be a leader in this kind of innovation? Is it a billboard campaign? Is it a what is it? What is it? Is it a reality TV show? How do you do it?
Well, I think it's an expectation of the people in the United States. I think we've come to the point where, whether it's Apple or Microsoft or any number of things that people use products for every day here in the United States that have literally changed the world and the way we live. It's an absolute expectation of American people that we remain leaders in that world, in the world of innovation. I don't think there's a whole lot of selling that needs to be done. I think the concern might be complacency, that just continues to happen without support from the government in terms of funding, without support from companies in terms of leadership. I think that more than anything is the greater challenge.
And I think there is an expectation that the public has, that the national labs do in a structured and a scientific way explore new avenues. Maybe I disagree with you just a little bit, because I do think there is that expectation. Those labs are the best on the planet in terms of what they do and the type of science. I'm not discounting the wildcatting. That does occur, and great innovations start that way, but the study of science, the validation that no physical laws are being violated in some technology, that's where you really get sort of foundational work that can grow to a full-scale power plant.
Thank you. I was noticing how the share of venture, I was reading a report on how the share of venture capital that goes to energy startups is pretty low compared to a lot of other industries, for a few reasons, in part because of the turnaround time and some other things. I'm kind of wondering whether, as we have all these questions about the robustness and strength of the federal role going forward, is the energy industry kind of writ large finding itself, at least the kind of parts of the energy industry that are involved in pioneering and commercializing the next waves of technologies, does there have to be a larger in-house R&D role going forward, if nothing else, as something as a hedge against ceding all this leadership to other countries, as we've been discussing? I ask because I was looking at a report that the centrist think tank Third Way put out, which was, and I think perhaps AEIC has made some of the same points, that if you look at the share of industry R&D spending as a percentage of sales, it's pretty low compared to a lot of other industries. So I'm wondering whether, as we talk about the need for robust federal investments, if we also need to see, as a hedge, if nothing else, increasing corporate commitments as well.
We're both on the button. So sometimes it's not how much you get. You suggest that there's not enough. We do have some opportunities where we leverage up those dollars in this industry in ways that other industries can't. That helps a lot. Utilities tend to participate together. They tend to co-develop technology. So I agree. As a sector, the energy sector is probably the lowest funder of R&D. We do aggressively go out and find other sources like the DOE to help boost that up.
The industry is going to continue to invest. That's what we do to thrive, to survive. The question is, at what rate do we invest? At what rate do we get help from others? And how quickly can we deploy the innovations and the technologies and bring them to market? We're going to continue to innovate. We're going to continue to create. But creating something and bringing it to market 15, 20 years later because the funds aren't there to test it and pilot it and deploy it, create a lag. Think about your laptop computer. If it would have taken another 30 years to be able to have that happen, what would we have missed over the last 30 years? And I think we ought to be looking at technology and innovation and deployment in a very similar way across the board. What are we missing? What would we be able to get to sooner, faster, better, quicker?
We've got a question from the audience here, but before I get to it, just one more reminder as our time gets a little bit closer to winding down. If you've got questions, please write them on the cards that you all have. And so one of the audience questions that came in asks, what would make the most difference for the U.S. economy? This is a very broad question. What would make the most difference in the U.S. For the U.S. economy in terms of energy R&D? What technology would create the most jobs? Any takers?
I'll jump in and I'll go a little bit towards what I said earlier. I think infrastructure right now is something that will open up doors for not only manufacturing and industry, but domestic job growth as well. Whether it's traditional infrastructure, roads and bridges, whether it's incorporating technologies that we've grown over the years, oxy-combustion to make steel, nitrogen curing to make better concrete bridges and roads, or advanced technologies that we've talked about here today. The opportunity to have an immediate or a more immediate return on investment, I think, in infrastructure is probably the best platform or example to drive innovation that we have before us right now.
Rich, I wanted to ask throw a related question your way, and it's frankly something of a raw politics question. There was an interesting Brookings Institution report a few weeks ago that looked at the concentration of clean tech patents, to some extent as, using that as something of a proxy for where the clean tech industry is. And while certainly it exists across the country and in geographic areas across the country, it's heavily concentrated in some places that, as you perhaps might expect, didn't necessarily vote for President Trump. And so that's a long way of saying, is there a sense perhaps politically in the White House that something like ARPA-E is not something that's relevant to Trump's base constituency?
You can't imagine that. If you look back at how ARPA-E's technology balance over the past 8 years, right, and perhaps at the places where the previous administration signaled with its budgets, right, there was certainly a bias toward a certain set of technologies, renewables, efficiency, EVs. Sort of if you will, a sort of very California view on what a American clean energy future looks like.
Yeah.
And so what we would hope, right, is that if we could get back to a place maybe a little closer to where we were at the tail end of the Bush administration, which was something like an all-of-the-above clean energy policy, where you have, really deep continued effort on all, zero emissions or low carbon, energy sources. That's something that's shared a little bit more widely, around the country. And frankly, actually something that, in terms of the base constituency, renewables are terrific. Renewables jobs are not actually that terrific, unfortunately. A lot of these technologies are very labor intensive, but the jobs aren't great. We're talking about, $20 an hour jobs versus, working in a nuclear power plant, right? That's that's easily a six-figure job for a nuclear operator. Frankly, mining in a coal mine is a good job. You can support a whole family around that in a way you might not be able to if you're a rooftop solar installer, right? And so using innovation to find routes to build those technologies so that we're building really good jobs that are well distributed across the country so that everyone can see a role for themselves in this future, as opposed to perhaps only seeing, folks on the other coast, we think is very important to building the political constituency for this.
Thank you. We've had some questions come in from the audience here. Let me ask one on rural energy and economic development. And this question is for the whole panel, so whoever wants to jump on it, or if all of you want to jump on it. The question is, given that rural residents experience a higher energy burden in terms of their income spent on energy use, what do you see as the opportunities and challenges of using energy efficiency as an economic development tool for rural, small-town America? So yeah, the challenges of using energy efficiency as an economic development tool in rural areas.
So I just briefly referred to it, Southern Company and other utilities as well, but Southern has two communities that we're developing now. One of them's under construction beginning this week that will basically be in full swing by the end of the year. And in fact, the homes that will be built in this will have the energy footprint of a half of what a similar home would have had 10 years ago. It's designed to produce the know-how for how a community like that would exist in the future. In fact, could be islanded. It'll have its own solar, its own battery, its own generation. It can be islanded from the grid. We hope to produce the knowledge there that helps us understand how we can deploy those sorts of communities elsewhere, both rural and urban settings. It's how you manage all of those assets, how you load the air conditioner, preload the air conditioner, or preload the water heater for the purposes of energy storage, not just a battery. You can use all sorts of other technologies to do it. So we're in the process of trying to understand how these new technologies can all be applied to a community such that all customers could benefit.
Thank you. Did either of you, the other two panelists, want to hop in on that question?
I think, again, as you take a look at the traditional and the future and the energy innovations that have gone into these things, all the things that you've talked about just now will involve materials that need to be manufactured, and those materials in themselves will take advances in technology and innovation. So it's not just what does this mean for the future? What will we understand? How can we reduce? How can we be more efficient? But how do we build upon industry and build upon innovation to make this happen and to actually make this work and function?
Thank you. I like this question. Okay, this gets to a really hot discussion right now, something that Bill Gates has been involved with. I think something of a running debate over the question of, are our energy and climate goals more dependent or most dependent on big breakthroughs still to happen, or is it more of a deployment of existing text question? That's my riff, but that's leading into this question here. The questioner notes that there hasn't been much discussion yet about mobilization of existing technologies. Many argue we already have the technology we need to meet our energy and climate goals. Why is energy innovation for its own sake important, and how can mobilization and innovation work together simultaneously?
Happy to start. I don't know how many folks saw the report, I believe, released yesterday that basically very thoroughly debunked the work by Jacobson and his team at Stanford that said we could easily get to a complete clean energy future using nothing but existing technologies. It sort of took that apart, chapter and verse, exposed major math errors in the underlying analysis. It's pretty bad for the 100% renewables with only the existing technologies line of reasoning. If you look at all of the different modeling efforts, and there have been literally more than a dozen of these that have looked at how we realistically get to 100% cleaning up our energy supply, it's hard to draw the conclusion that we have all the technologies we currently need. Just a couple of examples, right? So even if we were able to use renewables for 100% of our power sector, you can't really use renewables to generate the extreme temperatures that are needed to run a steel factory. So unless anyone is proposing that we're going to, sort of give up on steel and sort of, move to something else, and it's probably a while before we're going to do something like that, we're going to need other things to create all that heat and to create that heat in a way that doesn't produce any emissions. The kind of advanced nuclear reactors that Southern Company and the folks at TerraPower, Bill Gates' organization, are working to create are one possible source for that sort of thing, as are clean fossil fuels, that use carbon capture technology. But if you really look at how we're going to get there deeply and decarbonize our entire industry, which all the models say that we need to do at some point around the middle of the century, that is a vast challenge, and we find it very difficult to believe that we have everything we currently need to do that.
And one thing the TerraPower reactor provides is, and because you mentioned hydrogen, it provides a temperature that allows me to produce hydrogen. And then I produce a new energy stream that I start to look for fuel cells and all the many different ways I can use hydrogen as an energy stream.
Yeah, I mean it gets to this whole question of I guess the term of the term of art now is kind of is deep decarbonization, and as I mentioned before, I mean it seems like the fulcrum of this debate is how far we can get with existing technologies. If the goal that most people sort of lay out there is to sort of try and hit the 2C target is oftentimes something on the order of an 80% reduction by mid-century in power sector emissions. Mike, I wonder if you can weigh in on how close to getting there with existing tech can we get?
Well, I'd concur. I think we have a lot of existing technologies that can get us most of the way. I think, again, the deployment, the ability to scale up the deployment of those technologies, to test them, to demonstrate them, to use them, is really an important driver that we need to continue to push upon. Whether that's continued funding for carbon sequestration demonstrations, whether it's continued funding for hydrogen infrastructure build-outs, whatever the case is, I think these technologies and this innovation is here. Certainly not all of it has been discovered. We wouldn't be here if that was the case. But I think, again, the deployment, the ability to bring it to market, the ability to bring it sooner than later is an important driver here that we shouldn't ignore.
Thank you. And now we've got a very related question to that, actually. And the questioner says, there seems to be, the questioner says, there seems to be a gap between the government's view of a technology being ready for commercial or private investment and the investment community's view of readiness and risk. How do we bridge that gap in public-private partnerships? The fiscal year 18 budgets seem to be very arbitrary in terms of early versus later technology focus. So it's as kind of a follow-on, is the government sort of striking the right balance between looking at commercialization of existing tech and kind of early-stage research, and where should that balance be drawn?
So we think that this debate has gotten a little confused, right? You have this, we think, somewhat artificial distinction between basic and applied energy research and sort of the commercialization end. And what we think is the much more important axis, which is this an incremental breakthrough, an incremental advance, or is this a breakthrough advance? So we see the role for government extending higher up that axis when you have a breakthrough advance as opposed to an incremental advance. Should government be, subsidizing or deeply involved in completely mature energy technologies? Absolutely not, right? That shouldn't be the place for the market to start adopting those things. does government need a role in taking that last step and helping the first-of-a-kind demonstration project for something that's a true breakthrough, right? A major coal plant that produces no emissions, or a new nuclear reactor, or let's say a renewable technology that produces some kind of breakthrough new advance, a much higher conversion efficiency, or the ability to store power for the months at a time that some of these models say are going to be required. Those are appropriate roles for government much further up the spectrum. And so I do think that sometimes these things all get confused, and we would agree with this administration that there isn't a government role for that, that commercialization of incremental improvements. But we do think that we ought to be focused on that breakthrough axis instead.
Thank you. I think we are going to make that the last word. I would like to say thank you very much to all of our panelists. Very thoughtful, engaging discussion. So thank you again.